The ER was loud, with panic sirens fading outside, voices colliding inside when the shouting began. A nurse stood frozen at triage, her eyes steady, her hands still. They mocked her silence. They questioned her competence. Every word landed like a public sentence delivered under fluorescent lights. Then a man rose from the waiting area. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash a badge. He simply spoke calm, precise, absolute. Stand down. The room stopped breathing. No one knew who he was. No one knew why that single command cut through the chaos like a blade. But in that moment, power shifted. And the nurse everyone had dismissed didn't move an inch because she never needed to. This is a story about humiliation, restraint, and the kind of authority that doesn't announce itself until it has to. Before we begin, let me ask you, where are you watching from right now and what time is it there? Drop your location and local time in the comments. And if you're drawn to stories where silence carries weight and justice arrives unexpectedly, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The emergency room of Riverside Memorial Hospital never truly slept. It only shifted moods like a restless animal pacing under fluorescent lights. At 2:17 a.m., the mood was sharp, brittle, and close to breaking. Stretchers lined the hallway wall to wall. A multi-car pileup on Interstate 84 had flooded the ER with trauma patients, fractures, concussions, internal bleeding. The air smelled of antiseptic and stress. Monitors beeped in uneven rhythms, each one demanding attention, each one threatening consequences if ignored for even a second. At the center of it all was triage. Emily Carter stood behind the triage desk, her posture upright, shoulders relaxed, hands folded loosely in front of her tablet. Her brown hair was pulled back into a tight bun, not a strand out of place despite the chaos. Her eyes moved constantly left, right down the hall, tracking symptoms, faces, body language. She spoke only when necessary. BP 140/90, she said calmly to an aide. Priority yellow. Move him after Bay 3 opens. Her voice was steady. Too steady, some thought. Across from her, charge nurse Linda Morales exhaled sharply, her patience already worn thin. Linda had been running ER floors for nearly 15 years. She thrived on control volume and visibility. In her mind, a good nurse spoke loudly, moved fast, and made sure everyone knew who was in charge. Emily did none of that. Carter Linda snapped loud enough for nearby patients to hear. "What are you doing just standing there?" Emily looked up. "I'm tracking vitals and intake flow. Bay 3 clears in 40 seconds. Linda scoffed. "We don't have time for your quiet little pauses. This isn't a library." A few heads turned. A man clutching his arm winced, not from pain but from the tension in the air. Emily didn't react. She didn't apologize. She simply nodded once. Understood. That was it. No defensiveness. No explanation. And somehow that made it worse. Doctor Kevin Brooks emerged from Trauma Room 2, pulling off blood-stained gloves. He was young for an attending early 40s, sharp jawline, reputation for efficiency and ego in equal measure. "What's the hold-up at triage?" he demanded. Linda gestured openly toward Emily. "Ask her. She's freezing up." Emily met Dr. Brooks' gaze, unblinking. "We're at capacity. I'm prioritizing based on respiratory risk and internal trauma probability." Brooks frowned. "You're the new nurse, right?" "Yes, sir." "And you think you can run triage better than my charge nurse?" "I think we can reduce fatal delays if enough." Brooks cut in. "Just follow protocol. Don't improvise." Emily nodded again. "Yes, sir." The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, but its impact lingered. A few nurses exchanged looks. Some pitied Emily. Others dismissed her. A couple quietly judged her for not pushing back. None of them knew that silence to Emily was not weakness. It was discipline. 10 minutes later, the automatic doors burst open. EMS wheeled in a man on a gurney, late 40s, maybe early 50s, muscular beneath torn civilian clothes. His face was pale, sweat beading at his temples. His left side was rigid, his breathing shallow and uneven. "No ID," the paramedic called out. "Found unconscious near mile marker 117. Possible internal bleeding. Old scar tissue everywhere." Emily was already moving. She stepped forward, eyes scanning the patient in seconds. Chest rise, skin tone, pupils. Hands' calloused, scarred fingers curled slightly as if still gripping something. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "BP," she asked, dropping. 105, systolic and falling. Emily didn't hesitate. Priority red. "He goes next." Linda stepped in front of the gurney. "No, we've got 2 confirmed crash victims ahead of him." Emily looked at her. "This man's injuries don't match the report. He's compensating too well for how bad this is." "If we wait," Linda laughed, sharp and dismissive. "You've been here, 3 months? Don't lecture me." Dr. Brooks reappeared. "What's going on?" Emily spoke evenly. "He needs imaging now. There's a high probability of internal hemorrhage, retroperitoneal, possibly hepatic. His breathing pattern suggests that's enough," Brooks said. "Bay assignment stays as is." The gurney rolled past. Emily diverted down the hall. She watched it go, her eyes following the rhythm of the man's chest. Too controlled, too practiced. Someone who had learned how to breathe through pain. Emily returned to her station. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. But inside her chest, something tightened. She had seen this before. Minutes later, the alarm sounded. The man's heart rate spiked. Blood pressure crashed. Code blue trauma. 2. The ER snapped into motion. Nurses ran. Doctors shouted orders. The controlled chaos intensified. Emily moved without waiting for permission. She was already inside Trauma 2 when Dr. Brooks arrived, hands gloved, eyes wide with irritation and adrenaline. "What are you doing in here?" he barked. Emily was at the patient's side, adjusting oxygen, fingers pressing firmly against a point just below the ribcage. "Internal bleed," she said. "Right side. He's crashing." "How do you?" now, Emily said louder than before, not shouting but cutting through the noise. Brooks hesitated. "Just a fraction." Then he ordered imaging. The scan confirmed it seconds later. Emily stepped back, hands already clean, face unreadable. The patient stabilized barely. As the team worked, a hospital security officer entered quietly and approached Linda. "Charge Nurse Morales," he said. "Administration just got a call. High priority. Military." Linda stiffened. Military. They didn't say why, just that a transport may be inbound. Emily, standing in the corner, looked up. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. Outside, far above the hospital roof, a distant thrum echoed faintly through the night air. A sound most people wouldn't notice. Emily did. The first thing most people noticed in Trauma 2 was the noise, the overlapping commands, the hiss of oxygen, the frantic beeping of monitors struggling to keep rhythm with a failing body. But Emily Carter noticed something else. Silence. Not in the room itself, but in the patient. As nurses cut away the man's shirt and repositioned his arms, Emily watched his face. His jaw was clenched, tight lips pressed into a thin line. Even as pain rippled through his body, he made no sound. No groan, no curse, no plea. That kind of silence didn't come from shock alone. It came from training. "BP's still unstable," a nurse called out. "Heart rate, 130 and climbing." "Doctor." Brooks stood at the foot of the bed, eyes darting between the monitor and the scan images lighting up the screen beside him. "Prep for transfusion. We're losing him." Emily's hands moved almost automatically, checking lines, adjusting flow, her fingers firm and precise. She didn't crowd the doctor. She didn't challenge him, but every movement she made was purposeful, efficient, practiced far beyond what her short tenure suggested. Dr. Brooks noticed. "You've done trauma before," he said, not quite a question. Emily met his eyes. "Yes, sir," where she paused, just long enough to be honest without being specific. "Not in a hospital like this." Brooks frowned, but turned back to the patient. "Keep pressure there. If he spikes again, we intubate." "Yes, sir." Across the room, Linda Morales watched with crossed arms, irritation etched deep into her expression. Emily wasn't supposed to shine like this. She wasn't supposed to move like someone who belonged in the center of chaos. Linda leaned toward another nurse. "She's overstepping." The nurse didn't respond, because she was watching Emily too. As the minutes passed, the patient stabilized enough to be moved to imaging. The immediate crisis eased, but the tension in the ER did not. If anything, it thickened like a storm, gathering strength without warning. Emily stepped back into triage, wiping her hands. She felt the weight of eyes on her now. Different eyes, curious, measuring. She ignored them. Instead, she pulled up the patient's chart again. Still no name, no ID, no emergency contact. Just a series of old surgical scars noted by EMS, precise, symmetrical, clean. Military scars. She'd seen hundreds like them. A stretcher rolled past, and with it came a memory she didn't invite. Heat. Sand. The smell of metal and blood. A voice shouting coordinates. Hands moving exactly where they needed to, even as everything else fell apart. Emily exhaled slowly and grounded herself back in the present. Carter, Linda snapped. You don't get to decide when you jump in. Next time you wait for orders. Emily nodded. Understood. Linda stared at her, waiting for more. An apology. A defense. Something. Nothing came. Unbelievable, Linda muttered, walking away. Doctor. Brooks approached moments later, his tone clipped but different. Less hostile. More unsettled. You were right about the bleed, he said. If we'd waited... He didn't finish the sentence. Emily simply replied, I'm glad he's stable. Brooks studied her for a moment. Where did you train, Nurse Carter? Emily met his gaze calmly. I learned to treat what's in front of me. That wasn't an answer. Brooks didn't push, but the question lingered. At 254A, the sound came again, low, rhythmic, unmistakable. This time more people noticed. What is that? A patient asked from a wheelchair. Another nurse frowned. Is that a helicopter? The overhead speakers crackled to life. Attention staff. Possible incoming transfer. Stand by for further instructions. Linda straightened instantly, smoothing her scrubs like a general preparing for inspection. All right, listen up, she barked. No freelancing. We follow chain of command. Emily said nothing. She was already counting the seconds between the pulses of sound, judging distance, altitude, approach angle. Not medical instincts, operational ones. In imaging, the unidentified patient stirred. His eyes fluttered open, briefly unfocused but alert enough to scan the room. When his gaze landed on Emily standing just beyond the doorway, his breathing steadied, barely perceptible. But Emily saw it. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Recognition flickered. Then his eyes closed again. Emily's throat tightened. At 302A, M, the charge nurse's phone rang. Linda answered sharply. Morales. Her expression changed as she listened. Annoyance gave way to confusion. Confusion to unease. Yes, I understand. We'll prepare. She ended the call and looked around the ER, suddenly aware that every eye was on her. We're receiving a military transport, she announced. Priority patient. They'll be landing on the helipad. A murmur rippled through the room. Military transports didn't come without reason, and they didn't arrive quietly. Dr. Brooks approached. Any details? Linda shook her head. None there sharing. Emily felt it then, a subtle shift in the air. Not fear, not excitement, anticipation. She moved to the sink, washing her hands again, slower this time. She wasn't preparing for a procedure. She was preparing for exposure. A young nurse stepped beside her. Hey, she whispered, how did you know about that bleed earlier? Emily glanced at her. Pattern recognition. That's it. Emily allowed herself the smallest smile. That's enough. Outside, the helicopter's roar grew louder, rattling the windows. The lights overhead flickered slightly as the building absorbed the vibration. Security personnel moved toward the entrance. Administration staff hurried in faces, pale ties crooked. Linda adjusted her badge and turned to Emily. You stay out of the way. Emily met her gaze evenly. Yes, ma'am. But as the doors to the ER slid open and a gust of cold night air swept inside, Emily knew something Linda didn't. The moment she'd spent years avoiding was no longer avoidable, and when the people stepping off that helicopter asked their questions, silence would no longer protect anyone. The helicopter touched down with a force that seemed to press the night flat against the roof of Riverside Memorial Hospital. The windows along the ER corridor rattled and conversations died mid-sentence as the sound swallowed everything else. For a brief moment, the hospital felt less like a place of healing and more like a forward operating base, bracing for incoming orders. Emily Carter stood near the triage desk, hands loosely clasped, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if she could see straight through concrete and steel to the helipad above. She counted the seconds between the rotor beats without thinking. Old habits had a way of resurfacing when the air changed. Linda Morales was already issuing commands. Clear the hallways. I want a direct path from the elevator to Trauma 1. Brooks, get your team ready. Dr. Brooks nodded, adrenaline sharpening his movements. On it. No one asked Emily to move. No one asked her to stay. She existed in that familiar space between present, observant, unacknowledged. The elevator doors at the end of the corridor slid open with a metallic chime, and the mood shifted again. 2 hospital administrators stepped out first, their faces tight with forced professionalism. Behind them came 4 uniformed personnel in fatigues, clean, precise, unmistakably military. Their boots hit the floor in unison, each step measured, deliberate. Conversation ceased entirely. Patients stared. Nurses froze. Even Dr. Brooks slowed his confidence, giving way to uncertainty. One of the soldiers spoke quietly to the administrator, who nodded and gestured down the hall. Trauma 2, she said. Unidentified patient. Stabilized but critical. The lead soldier's gaze moved instantly to Trauma 2, then briefly across the ER. It paused on Emily, just for a heartbeat. Then it moved on. Emily felt the weight of it settle in her chest, heavy and familiar. She lowered her eyes, not in submission, but in restraint. Linda stepped forward, forcing a bright smile. I'm Charge Nurse Morales. How can we assist? The soldier regarded her without expression. We'll need access to the patient immediately, and we'll require privacy. Of course, Linda said quickly. Anything you need. As they moved past, the other soldiers fanned out instinctively, positioning themselves at corners and doorways. Not aggressive, protective. The kind of formation that spoke of long practice under pressure. Emily followed at a distance, not because she was told to, but because something in her knew she needed to be close. Inside Trauma 2, the patient lay unconscious, chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance. His color had improved slightly, but the lines of pain remained etched deep into his face. The lead soldier stepped forward, eyes scanning the monitors with a fluency that surprised Dr. Brooks. Vitals, he asked. Stabilized for now, Brooks replied. Internal bleeding controlled. We're prepping for surgery. The soldier nodded once. Good. His gaze shifted to Emily, who stood near the wall, hands behind her back. Who's that? He asked. Linda answered immediately. Just a triage nurse. She assisted earlier. Emily felt the word just settle like a quiet insult. She didn't react. The soldier studied her more closely now. Name Emily met his eyes. Emily Carter. Something flickered there. Recognition, or at least confirmation. The soldier turned back to the patient. He asked for you. The room went still. Dr. Brooks blinked. He's been unconscious. He wasn't earlier, the soldier said. And when he was lucid, that's the name he gave. Linda frowned. That doesn't make any sense. Emily felt her pulse quicken, but her voice remained even. I spoke with him briefly. He didn't give me his name. He didn't need to, the soldier replied. He knew yours. Silence pressed in from all sides. Dr. Brooks cleared his throat. If you'll excuse us, we need to prep. The soldier raised a hand. Not forceful, just final. We'll wait. Emily stepped forward before anyone could stop her. She approached the bed slowly, deliberately, her presence calm and grounding. She adjusted the monitor slightly, checked the IV lines, her movements gentle but assured. The patient stirred. His eyes opened halfway, unfocused at first. Then they found her. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. His lips moved. Emily leaned in just enough to hear him. Still quiet, he whispered. Emily swallowed. You should be resting. Didn't think I'd see you here, he murmured. Not like this. Neither did I, she replied softly. The soldier watched the exchange closely, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly from observer to witness. Linda crossed her arms. I don't understand what's happening. The soldier turned to her. You don't need to. Emily straightened, stepping back. He needs surgery. The sooner the better. The soldier nodded. Make it happen. Dr. Brooks hesitated. Hospital protocol. The soldier met his gaze. Doctor with respect protocol is the reason he's alive. She's the reason he'll stay that way. Brooks looked at Emily again, really looked this time. Not as a subordinate, not as an obstacle. As a variable he had misjudged. Outside the room, murmurs spread. Staff whispered. Phones buzzed. Word traveled fast when uniforms entered civilian spaces. Emily returned to triage as surgery prep began. She resumed her position behind the desk, just another nurse in scrubs watching names scroll across the intake board. Linda approached her slowly. Her earlier confidence cracked. "What did you do to earn that kind of attention?" Linda asked quietly. Emily didn't look up. "I did my job," Linda scoffed weakly. "No one gets that kind of backup for just doing their job." Emily finally met her eyes. "Some jobs don't end when the uniform comes off." Before Linda could respond, a man stood up from the waiting area. He had been there for hours, quiet, unassuming, dressed in a plain jacket and worn jeans. Most people had mistaken him for a family member waiting on bad news. Emily noticed the way he moved before anyone else did. He rose without urgency but with purpose. His posture straightened, his presence expanding as if he'd stepped into a different role entirely. He walked toward Triage. Linda opened her mouth. "Sir, you can't." He didn't stop. When he spoke, his voice carried easily over the noise of the ER, calm, measured, and absolute. "Stand down." The words cut through the room like a blade. Every movement halted. Every sound fell away. Emily closed her eyes for just a moment, because she knew that voice, and she knew what came next would change everything. For a full second after the words left his mouth, no one moved. "Stand down." They weren't shouted. They weren't amplified. They didn't need to be. The emergency room, so accustomed to noise, urgency, and competing authority, froze in a way that felt almost unnatural. A nurse, halfway through pushing a medication cart, stopped mid-step. A doctor with a chart raised froze with his hand in the air. Even the monitors seemed to soften their beeping as if the room itself were listening. Linda Morales was the first to react. "This is a restricted area," she snapped, color rising in her cheeks. "Sir, you need to sit back down." The man didn't even look at her. He was facing Emily. Up close, the signs were impossible to miss. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered despite the civilian jacket. His hair was cut short, peppered with grey. His eyes, steady alert, had the kind of calm that didn't come from comfort but from having survived chaos far worse than this. Emily met his gaze evenly. There was no surprise in her expression, only recognition. "Yes, Captain," she said quietly. The title landed like a dropped instrument. "Captain." Dr. Brooks stiffened. A few nurses exchanged stunned glances. Linda's mouth opened, then closed again. The man finally turned toward Linda, his expression controlled but unmistakably firm. "I'll speak with you in a moment." Linda straightened, trying to recover authority. "You can't just issue commands in my ER." The captain regarded her with something close to patience. "I didn't issue a command," he said. "I prevented a mistake." He gestured subtly toward Emily. "She stays where she is." Dr. Brooks stepped forward, his tone cautious now. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a hospital. We follow medical hierarchy." The captain nodded once. "And I respect that. But hierarchy doesn't excuse humiliation." The word hung in the air. Emily felt eyes on her from every direction now. Some curious, some ashamed, some still skeptical. Linda crossed her arms. "You don't know what you're talking about." The captain turned fully to her, his posture straightening. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply introduced himself. "Captain James Walker, United States Army." A murmur rippled through the room. Walker continued. "The patient you just stabilized is under my responsibility, and the nurse you just tried to sideline is the reason he's alive." Linda laughed nervously. "That's absurd." Walker's gaze sharpened. "Is it he?" Looked to Dr. Brooks. Doctor who identified the internal bleed. Brooks hesitated, then answered Nurse Carter. "And who insisted on immediate intervention?" "Nurse Carter." Walker nodded. "Then I suggest we adjust how we speak to her." Silence returned heavier this time. Emily shifted, slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "Captain, this isn't necessary." Walker glanced at her, his tone softening just enough. "You always say that." Linda's voice trembled with anger now. "Even if what you're saying is true, she's still my subordinate." Walker took a step closer. "No," he said evenly. "She's your colleague, and you forgot the difference." Across the ER, one of the soldiers from earlier moved subtly closer to the entrance, his presence a quiet reminder that this wasn't a debate. Emily had to fight alone. Dr. Brooks cleared his throat. "Captain Walker, perhaps we should continue this discussion privately." Walker considered it. then shook his head. No, this happened publicly, so will its correction. He turned back to Emily. Permission to speak freely, Emily hesitated. For a split second, the weight of years pressed against her ribs, the discipline, the instinct to stay invisible, the promise she'd made herself to live quietly. Then she nodded. Permission granted. A few people caught the exchange. Fewer understood it. Walker addressed the room. Nurse Carter served as a combat medic attached to special operations units for 8 years. She treated casualties under fire in environments where hesitation meant death. Gasps broke out. Linda stared at Emily, disbelief etched across her face. That's impossible. She's just quiet. Walker finished. Yes, because loud doesn't save lives. Competence does. Emily felt her pulse hammer now, not from fear but from exposure. She hadn't wanted this, hadn't planned it. But Walker wasn't done. She left the service without ceremony, he continued. No medals on the wall, no speeches. She chose this hospital because she wanted to heal without rank or salutes. His gaze hardened. And you humiliated her for it. The words landed with surgical precision. Linda's face flushed, then paled. I didn't know. Walker's reply was immediate. You didn't ask. Dr. Brooks swallowed. Emily, is this true? Emily met his eyes. Yes. He looked away, shame flickering across his features. The patient's heart monitor beeped steadily, now a quiet counterpoint to the tension filling the room. Linda opened her mouth again, then closed it. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Walker took a step back, signaling an end. This hospital has good people, but good people still make mistakes when they confuse authority with respect. He looked at Emily once more. You did exactly what you always do. You saw the problem. You solved it. You didn't need recognition. Emily nodded slightly. Thank you, sir. Walker gave the faintest smile. Stand down doesn't always mean stop, he said. Sometimes it means listen. With that, he turned and walked back toward the waiting area, the soldiers subtly repositioning around him. The ER slowly came back to life. Whispers followed Emily wherever she moved now. Apologies hung unsaid. Respect replaced dismissal, but awkwardly, like a language people weren't fluent in yet. Linda approached her again, this time without anger. I may have misjudged you. Emily looked at her calmly. That happens. Linda hesitated. I owe you an apology. Emily nodded once. Then we're done here. As Emily returned to triage, her hands steady once more, she felt the shift, not just in how others saw her, but in how the room breathed around her. Yet even as the tension eased, she knew this wasn't over. Because exposure had consequences. And the kind of truth that had just surfaced never stayed contained for long. The emergency room didn't return to normal. It recalibrated. People spoke more softly. Orders were still given, but now they were measured careful, like everyone had suddenly become aware that authority could be questioned by competence alone. Emily Carter felt the change immediately. Not in grand gestures, but in the smallest details, a nurse stepping aside to give her space, a resident asking, before interrupting a patient, looking at her with something closer to trust than fear. She didn't acknowledge any of it. She logged vitals. She directed intake. She did her job. But beneath the surface, the ER was buzzing. Combat medic, someone whispered near the supply cart. Special operations, another replied, half in disbelief. Dr. Brooks stood near the nurse's station, flipping through a chart without really reading it. Every so often, his eyes drifted toward Emily, then away again. He replayed the earlier moments in his head, the way she'd spoken with certainty, the way she'd moved without hesitation. He'd mistaken quiet for inexperience. He wasn't used to being wrong in public. Linda Morales remained unusually silent. She busied herself with paperwork, her movements rigid, her jaw tight. Every few minutes she glanced toward Emily, as if weighing whether to speak or whether speaking would only make things worse. In Trauma 1, the patient was prepped for surgery. The military detail remained nearby, unobtrusive but ever present. Their posture never relaxed, not even when they sat. Emily checked the board again. Intake was slowing. The worst of the accident victims had been stabilized or transferred. The night, for the first time in hours, seemed to loosen its grip. That was when the alarms sounded again. Not from Trauma 1. From Triage. A man in his late 20s collapsed near the waiting area, clutching his chest. He went down hard, knocking over a chair. Panic flared instantly. "Syncopal episode," someone shouted. Emily was already moving. She dropped to one knee beside him, fingers at his carotid artery. "Pulse is weak. Get me a monitor. Now." A young nurse rushed to comply. "Doctor," Brooks approached, snapping into his role. "What do we have?" "Possible cardiac event," Emily replied. "But his skin temps off. Could be a pulmonary embolism." Brooks nodded. "Good catch. Let's move." As they lifted the patient onto a stretcher, Emily noticed something that made her pause, a small tattoo just above the man's collarbone. Faded. Simple. A unit insignia most people wouldn't recognize. She felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Another one. The patient gasped, suddenly eyes wide. "Don't let them." Emily leaned close. "Let who?" He tried to speak again, but his body convulsed as the monitor began to scream. "V-fib," Brooks shouted. "Clear." The shock jolted the man's body, lifting him off the bed for a fraction of a second. Emily's jaw clenched as she watched the rhythm attempt to reassert itself. They worked him for nearly 10 minutes before stabilizing him. As they wheeled him toward Trauma 3, Emily caught sight of Captain Walker standing near the hallway entrance, speaking quietly with one of his soldiers. The captain's eyes met hers. He saw the look on her face. "What is it?" he asked, approaching. Emily lowered her voice. "That tattoo. He's military. Same community." Walker's expression darkened slightly. "Active, I don't know yet," Emily said. "But he was scared. Not of dying, of someone else." Walker exhaled slowly. "That makes 2. Emily frowned. Walker hesitated, then nodded toward Trauma 1. The first patient. He wasn't in a car accident. That was cover. Emily absorbed that in silence. It fit too well. Before she could ask more, a hospital administrator hurried toward them, her face tight. "Captain Walker, we need to discuss security." Walker turned to her. "What happened? We just received a call," the administrator said. "Someone claiming to be federal. They're asking about 2 specific patients. By name." Emily's pulse spiked. "They have names now." "Yes," the administrator replied. "And they're very insistent." Walker's jaw tightened. "Did you verify credentials?" "We're trying to," she said, "but they're pressuring us." Walker looked at Emily. "Stay close." She nodded. Within minutes, 2 men in dark suits entered the ER. They moved with confidence, flashing badges too quickly for most people to read. The kind of confidence that relied on people not asking questions. "I'm Special Agent Harris," one of them said. "This is Agent Cole. We're here regarding 2 federal matters." Linda straightened instantly, eager to regain footing. "Of course. How can we help?" Harris smiled thinly. "We'll need access to your trauma rooms. Immediately." Dr. Brooks stepped forward. On what grounds? Harris's smile didn't waver. National security. Emily watched them carefully. Their posture was off. Too casual. Too practiced. Walker stepped beside her. "I'll need to see full credentials." Harris's eyes flicked to him. "And you are Captain James Walker," he replied evenly. "And I'm responsible for those patients." Cole scoffed. "With respect, Captain, this is above your pay grade." Walker's voice dropped. "No, it isn't." The tension snapped tight. Emily felt it then, the unmistakable sense that something was closing in. Not loud, not fast, but deliberate. Harris sighed theatrically. "Look, we don't have time for this. These individuals are persons of interest. If you interfere, you'll be obstructing an investigation." Emily stepped forward before she could stop herself. An investigation into what Harris turned to her eyes cold. "That doesn't concern you, nurse." Walker glanced at Emily, a silent warning. But it was too late. Emily held Harris's gaze. "Then you won't mind waiting until proper verification is complete." Cole took a step closer. "Careful." Walker stepped between them. "She's right. You'll wait." For a moment it looked like Harris might push the issue. Then a phone rang. Cole answered, listened, then stiffened. He covered the receiver and leaned toward Harris. "We've got movement outside." Harris cursed under his breath. Walker's eyes narrowed. "What kind of movement?" Before Harris could answer, the sound reached them, vehicles pulling up fast, doors slamming, boots on pavement. Security rushed toward the entrance. Emily felt a chill creep up her spine. Because whatever was unfolding now, it wasn't over jurisdiction, it was over control. And the ER was about to become the center of something far bigger than a night shift had any right to handle. The automatic doors at the far end of the ER slid open again, harder this time, forced by urgency rather than routine. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the sharp scent of asphalt and rain. 2 black SUVs idled outside, engines still running. Their headlights cut across the waiting area like interrogation lamps. Hospital security hesitated at the threshold. They didn't know who they were supposed to stop. Emily Carter felt the shift before anyone spoke. It was the same feeling she'd had in places far from hospitals, when lines blurred, when authority became a costume, when the wrong people showed up pretending to be the right ones. Captain Walker stepped forward, his posture subtly changing. Not aggressive, alert. "Everyone hold position," he said calmly. Agent Harris turned sharply. "You don't give orders here." Walker didn't look at him. His eyes were on the men stepping out of the SUVs. "No," he replied, "but I recognize patterns." 4 figures approached the entrance. They weren't dressed alike, but they moved alike, spacing, precise eyes, scanning hands, never fully relaxed. 2 coordinated for federal investigators on a routine inquiry. 2 impatient for people who expected cooperation. Linda Morales whispered urgently to Dr. Brooks, "Should we call hospital administration?" Dr. Brooks shook his head slowly. "Something's wrong." Emily took a step closer to Walker. "They're not here for paperwork," she said quietly. "They're here to move someone." Walker nodded once. "I know." Agent Cole noticed the exchange and bristled. "This is getting ridiculous," he snapped. "We're taking custody of the patients now." He started toward Trauma 1. That was the moment Emily spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. No, the word didn't echo like Walker's earlier command. It didn't need to. It landed firm and grounded, backed by something deeper than volume. Cole stopped mid-step and turned toward her, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me," Emily met his gaze, her voice steady. "You don't have jurisdiction here, and you're not law enforcement." A hush fell over the room. Cole laughed, sharp and humorless. "You sure about that?" Nurse Emily nodded. "Yes." Harris stepped in quickly. "This is a serious accusation." Emily didn't look at him. Her eyes were on Cole's badge. "Your credentials are outdated. The seal placement changed 3 years ago. And your posture," she glanced briefly at Harris, "is protective, not investigative," Walker added quietly. "And you entered without notifying base command." Harris's jaw tightened. "This is over your head." Walker finally turned to face him fully. "You keep saying that," he said, "but you haven't answered a single question." Outside, one of the approaching men reached for his jacket. Hospital security stiffened. Hands visible. Walker ordered calmly. The man froze. Everything happened very quickly after that. A voice boomed from behind the SUVs. "Nobody move." Uniformed military police emerged from the shadows, weapons lowered but ready. Their insignia was clear, their authority unmistakable. The men at the entrance raised their hands slowly. Harris cursed under his breath. Emily exhaled tension she hadn't fully acknowledged draining from her shoulders. Walker didn't smile. "You should have stood down when you had the chance." The imposters were escorted out without resistance. No shouting, no spectacle. Just the quiet removal of a threat that never belonged there in the first place. The ER remained silent long after the doors closed again. Linda Morales looked around pale. "What? What just happened?" Walker turned to her. "You were almost compromised." Dr. Brooks swallowed. "Those men, they weren't federal, no," Walker replied. "They were contractors, trying to extract assets." Emily felt eyes on her again, but this time they weren't judging. They were searching for understanding, for reassurance. She stepped forward slightly. "The patients are safe," she said. "That's what matters." One of the younger nurses finally found her voice. "How did you know?" Emily considered the question. "Because fear has a sound," she said, and theirs didn't match the situation. Linda approached her slowly, her earlier authority stripped away, replaced by something fragile. "You could have said something sooner." Emily met her gaze. "I did, in the way that mattered." Linda nodded, shame flickering across her face. "I was wrong about you." Emily didn't respond. She didn't need to. In trauma, one surgery began without delay. The military detail remained outside, silent sentinels in scrubs and boots. In trauma 3, the second patient stabilized his breathing, evening out under careful monitoring. Captain Walker approached Emily near the triage desk, lowering his voice. "You handled that well." Emily gave a small nod. "So did you." He studied her for a moment. "You still don't like being seen?" She almost smiled. "I like the work more than the attention." Walker sighed softly. "That hasn't changed." "No," she agreed. "It hasn't." Across the ER, conversations resumed, hesitant at first, then steadier. But something fundamental had shifted. People spoke with more intention. They listened. "Doctor." Brooks approached Emily, his tone different now. Humble. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For earlier. For all of it." Emily looked at him. "We all missed something tonight." He nodded. "Not you." She didn't correct him. As the night deepened, the ER found its rhythm again. Not the frantic chaos from before, but something calmer, more deliberate. The kind of rhythm that came from trust. Emily returned to triage fully, now directing flow, coordinating care. No one questioned her decisions. No one raised their voice. And when the second patient briefly regained consciousness, his eyes searched the room until they found her. She stepped closer. "Still here," he whispered. Emily nodded. "You're safe." He closed his eyes, relief washing over his features. Captain Walker watched from a distance, hands clasped behind his back. He knew this moment mattered more than any confrontation. Quiet recognition. Silent trust. Linda Morales stood nearby, observing. For the first time in years, she said nothing at all. As the clock crept toward dawn, Emily allowed herself one small, private thought. She had tried to live unseen. But sometimes the world forced the truth into the light, not to punish silence, but to remind everyone that strength didn't always announce itself. And when it did speak, people listened. By the time the clock above the nurse's station clicked past 4:30 a.m., the night felt older than it should have. The ER lights seemed harsher now, not brighter, as if they were exposing things that had been hidden for far too long. Coffee cups sat untouched. Conversations stayed low and deliberate. No one wanted to be the one who shattered the fragile calm. Captain Walker stood near the glass wall outside Trauma 1, watching the surgical team work. His face revealed nothing, but his hands clasped behind his back were tight. He had spent years commanding people under fire, years making decisions that lived with him long after the noise faded. Tonight was different. Tonight the battlefield wore scrubs and smelled like antiseptic. Emily Carter moved through triage with quiet efficiency. Her world had narrowed again to vitals intake notes, subtle changes in breathing and posture. That was how she coped. Focus narrowed the noise. It always had. A nurse approached her hesitantly. "Emily, trauma. One just asked if you could step in." Emily looked up. "They have everything they need. They're requesting you specifically." Emily's jaw tightened. She glanced toward the glass wall where Dr. Brooks stood, scrubbed in his eyes, flicking toward her before returning to the patient. "I'll go," she said. Inside Trauma 1, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The patient lay open on the table, blood loss managed but not resolved. The surgeon, Dr. Helen Avery, looked up as Emily entered. "You're Carter," Avery said. "You saw him first." "Yes, ma'am." "What did we miss?" Emily stepped closer, eyes scanning the exposed field, the monitors, the positioning. She didn't touch anything. She didn't need to. "There," she said, quietly pointing. "The bleed's not where you expect it to be. It's tracking along old scar tissue. If you follow the obvious path, you'll chase it too late." Avery studied the area, then adjusted her approach. Seconds later, blood flow slowed. Avery exhaled. "Good call." Emily nodded and stepped back. "I'll return to triage." As she turned to leave, Avery spoke again. "You don't work like a hospital nurse." Emily paused. "I learned somewhere else." Avery didn't press. Outside, Captain Walker watched Emily emerge, her expression unchanged. "You didn't have to do that." Emily met his gaze. "Yes, I did." He nodded. "That's why I trusted you." Across the ER, Linda Morales observed the exchange from a distance. She felt like a guest in her own department, now present but no longer in control of the narrative. Every instinct she had honed over years told her to reassert authority, to reclaim her space. Instead, she did something unfamiliar. She watched. At 4:52 a.m., the second patient, Trauma 3, suddenly spiked a fever. The monitor alarms flared, sharp and insistent. Temps climbing 104 Fahrenheit, a nurse called out. Emily was already there. She assessed quickly. He's septic, likely from an untreated injury. Dr. Brooks joined her eyes sharp. We start broad-spectrum antibiotics. Now, as the team moved, Emily caught a glimpse of something folded beneath the patient's gown, a small laminated card taped close to his ribs. She gently lifted it. A blood type, emergency code, and a unit designation that made her stomach drop. She closed her eyes for half a second. Walker was beside her almost instantly. "What is it?" Emily showed him the card. "They're both tied to the same operation." Walker's expression hardened. "That explains the extraction attempt." "This hospital wasn't random," Emily said. "Neither were they." Walker nodded. "Someone wants them moved before they can talk." Linda overheard enough to pale. Talk about what Walker turned to her. About a mission that went wrong and people who don't want accountability. Linda swallowed. "And us. You were collateral," Walker said. "So was she." He gestured toward Emily. The words landed heavily. Linda looked at Emily, really looked at her, not as a subordinate, not as a threat, but as someone who had been carrying weight no one else could see. "I didn't protect you," Linda said quietly. Emily met her gaze. "You can now." Linda nodded slowly. "Tell me what you need." It was the first time she had ever said that to Emily. At 5:10 a.m., hospital administration convened in a glass-walled conference room near the ER. Lawyers were called. Phones buzzed with incoming directives. But one decision was made quickly and unanimously. No one left without proper authorization. Security was doubled. Doors were locked. Information was controlled. And for the first time that night, the hospital wasn't reacting. It was holding its ground. Emily returned to triage as dawn hinted faintly through the narrow windows high on the walls. The sky outside lightened from black to deep blue, then to gray. She felt the shift in her bones, the quiet release that came when the worst had passed. Captain Walker approached her one last time before stepping away to make a call. "Whatever happens next," he said, "you didn't fail your promise." Emily looked at him. "I never stopped serving," she said. "I just changed where." He smiled faintly. "Some people never understand that." Across the room, Dr. Brooks watched Emily coordinate intake with a confidence that no longer needed permission. He realized something then that unsettled him more than any confrontation. Emily hadn't changed. They had. As the sun rose higher, the ER exhaled. Patients stabilized. Crisis receded. And the story that had begun with humiliation and silence moved towards something else entirely. Not resolution yet, but reckoning. Because the truth was no longer contained within the walls of Riverside Memorial Hospital. And when it finally surfaced, no one involved would be able to look away. Morning arrived without ceremony. The first hints of daylight filtered through the high, narrow windows of the ER, painting pale rectangles across the polished floor. The chaos of the night had receded, but it hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed shape, compressed into quiet conversations, legal briefings, and the uneasy awareness that something much larger had brushed against this hospital and moved on only partially satisfied. Emily Carter felt it in the air as she checked the intake board. Fewer names now, fewer alarms. But the tension hadn't lifted. It had settled deeper, like sediment after a storm. Captain Walker stood near the conference room, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and clipped. Whatever call he was on, it wasn't routine. His shoulders were squared, his stance firm, the posture of someone bracing for consequences rather than relief. Linda Morales approached Emily slowly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She hesitated before offering one. "I didn't know how you take it," Linda said quietly. Emily accepted the cup. "Black is fine." Linda nodded, relieved by the simplicity of the answer. They stood side by side in silence for a moment, watching a patient being discharged down the hall. "I keep replaying it," Linda said finally. "All the moments I could have handled differently." Emily took a sip, unfazed. "You're replaying because you care." Linda looked at her. "I thought authority meant control." Emily met her gaze. "Authority means responsibility." Linda absorbed that, eyes dropping to the floor. "I failed at that." Emily shook her head slightly. "You corrected it. That matters." It was more grace than Linda felt she deserved. Across the ER, Dr. Brooks exited trauma, one exhaustion etched into his face. He pulled off his cap and ran a hand through his hair, then noticed Emily watching him. "He's stable," Brooks said. "Both of them are." Emily let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Good." Brooks hesitated, then added, "We're transferring them to ICU under guard. Administration approved it." "Under whose authority?" Emily asked. Before Brooks could answer, Captain Walker joined them. "Mine," he said. "For now." Linda stiffened. "For now," Walker nodded. "An inquiry's been triggered. Not internal. External." Dr. Brooks frowned. "What does that mean for us?" "It means Walker said evenly that what happened here won't stay here." Emily felt the weight of that statement settle into her chest. She had known this moment would come. Exposure always had a cost. "They'll want statements," Walker continued. "Timelines. Names." Linda swallowed, and Emily Walker looked at Emily, his expression unreadable. "They'll want to talk to her most of all." Emily nodded once. "That's fine." Linda turned to her sharply. "It shouldn't be. You came here to work quietly." Emily gave a faint smile. "I came here to help people." Walker studied her. "You don't regret it," Emily shook her head. "I regret the things I didn't do sooner, not the ones I did." Walker exhaled, something like pride flickering briefly across his features. "You're going to be asked why you didn't disclose your background." Emily met his eyes. "Because it wasn't relevant. Until it was." He nodded. "That answer won't satisfy everyone." "It doesn't have to," she replied. "It's the truth." Down the hall, the ICU doors opened, and the first patient was transferred under the watchful eyes of military police. The movement drew stares, whispers, phones discreetly lifted and lowered. The hospital was waking up, and with it came scrutiny. By 7:15 a.m., administrators filled the conference room. Lawyers dialed in. Security briefed leadership. The words "breach liability" and "jurisdiction" bounced off glass walls. Emily remained at triage, exactly where she had been all night. That, more than anything, unsettled people. A hospital attorney approached her, clipboard in hand. "Nurse Carter will need a statement." Emily nodded. "I'll provide one after shift change." The attorney blinked. "You're staying on?" Emily glanced at the board. "We're short 2 nurses. Patients don't pause for inquiries." The attorney opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Of course." Linda watched the exchange with something close to awe. "I would have sent you home," she admitted. Emily looked at her. That wouldn't have helped anyone. Walker overheard and allowed himself a small smile. At 8:03 a.m., the second patient regained consciousness fully. Emily was there when it happened, adjusting his IV when his eyes snapped open, alert and sharp despite the pain. He looked at her, recognition immediate. "They came," he said hoarsely. "Yes," Emily replied. "And they left." He exhaled slowly. "You didn't?" "No." He studied her for a moment. "You still don't talk much." Emily smiled faintly. "You still notice everything." A beat passed. "Will they come back?" he asked. Emily met his gaze honestly. "They might try. And you?" "I'll be here," she said. "So will others." He nodded, reassured not by bravado but by certainty. Outside the room, Walker listened, arms folded. He knew that tone. The quiet promise that didn't need backup. Later that morning, as the night staff began to rotate out, Emily finished her charting and logged out of the system. She removed her badge, clipped it to her pocket, and exhaled. Linda stopped her at the locker area. "I'm putting in a recommendation." Emily frowned. "For what trauma triage lead?" Linda said. "Temporary, at least." Emily shook her head. "I don't want a title." Linda met her eyes. "It's not about you." Emily considered that, then nodded. "Temporary is fine." Walker approached one last time before leaving the ER. "They'll call you," he said. "Soon. I know. If you need representation, I can handle it," Emily said gently. He studied her, then nodded. "Of course, you can." As Walker turned to leave, Linda spoke up. "Captain," he paused. "Thank you," Linda said, "for stopping me." Walker regarded her for a long moment. "Thank her," he replied, nodding toward Emily. "She's the reason this didn't end worse." Walker left. The ER continued its steady rhythm. Day shift took over. New faces replaced tired ones. But something fundamental had changed. Emily knew it. They all did. The truth had surfaced, not with violence but with restraint. Not with shouting, but with a single command and the courage to listen. And now that it was out, there would be consequences. Not just for those who came looking for control, but for everyone who had mistaken silence for weakness. The inquiry arrived quietly, but it carried weight. By mid-morning, Riverside Memorial no longer felt like a hospital alone. It felt like a place under observation. Unmarked sedans lined the staff entrance. Security badges were checked twice. Conversations stopped when unfamiliar footsteps echoed down the hall. Emily Carter noticed all of it and acknowledged none of it. She moved through the ER with the same steady rhythm she always had, checking vitals, guiding intake, adjusting flow when beds opened. If the pressure touched her, it didn't show. Silence had always been her armor, not to hide but to endure. In the conference room, Captain Walker stood before a small group of officials, men and women in tailored suits, expressions neutral, eyes sharp. They didn't introduce themselves by rank. They didn't need to. They asked questions. "When did you identify the threat?" Walker answered plainly. "When they moved without authorization and pushed for immediate extraction. Why didn't you comply? Because their story didn't match their behavior." And Nurse Carter Walker didn't hesitate. She saw it first. Across the glass wall, Emily felt the moment before it arrived. The subtle pause in the air, the sense of attention turning her way. An administrator approached. "They're ready for you now." Emily nodded. She handed off triage to another nurse and followed unhurried. Inside the room, every eye turned to her. She stood straight, hands relaxed at her sides, scrubs unwrinkled despite the long night. No insignia, no reminders of where she'd been before. Just a nurse. "Miss Carter," one of the officials said. "Thank you for coming." Emily met his gaze. "Of course." They asked about the patients. She answered with clinical precision. They asked about the men posing as federal agents. She described posture language inconsistencies. They asked about her background. Emily paused just long enough to choose accuracy over defense. "I served as a combat medic," she said, "attached to units that operated in high-risk environments. Why didn't you disclose that to hospital administration? Because it wasn't relevant to the job I was hired to do," Emily replied calmly. "I was asked to care for patients. I did." One of the officials leaned forward. "You don't think prior experience in special operations is relevant in an ER?" Emily met his eyes. "Experience doesn't save lives," she said. "Application does." Silence followed. Finally, another official spoke. "You disobeyed a superior's directive." Emily nodded. "Yes." "Why?" "Because following it would have cost a patient his life." No hesitation, no apology. The official studied her. "And if you had been wrong," Emily didn't look away. "Then I would have accepted the consequences." The questioning ended shortly after. Outside, Linda Morales waited, arms folded tightly across her chest. When Emily emerged, Linda searched her face for signs of strain. "Are you okay?" she asked. Emily nodded. "They asked questions, and I answered." Linda exhaled slowly. "That's it. That's enough." Down the hall, Dr. Brooks watched as Emily returned to triage without ceremony. The inquiry had rattled him more than he'd expected. He'd built his confidence on credentials, titles, authority. And yet the calmest person in the room had been the one with the least visible power. He approached her, voice low. "They're reviewing my conduct too." Emily glanced at him. "That's appropriate." He nodded. "I thought I needed to defend myself." "You don't," Emily said. "You need to reflect." He swallowed. "I will." In ICU, both patients remained stable. Guards rotated quietly. No one tried to breach security again. At noon, Captain Walker rejoined Emily near the triage desk. "They're standing down," he said. Emily raised an eyebrow. "All ready, for now," Walker replied. "The contractors are being detained. Questions are being asked in places that matter, and the patients, they'll be protected." Emily nodded. "Good." Walker studied her. "You understand this may follow you." Emily looked at the board at the names waiting for care. "Everything worth doing does." Linda approached cautiously. "Administration wants to make a statement." Emily sighed softly. "I'd prefer they didn't. They want to highlight professionalism under pressure." Emily met her gaze. "Then don't use my name." Linda hesitated. You saved lives. So did everyone else, Emily replied. Focus on that. Linda nodded slowly. All right. The afternoon passed without incident. No alarms, no confrontations, just the steady work of healing. As Emily finished charting near the end of her shift, a young resident approached her nervously. Miss Carter, he said, I just wanted to say, I've never seen anyone handle pressure like that. Emily smiled faintly. You will, she said, if you stay long enough. At 6:42 p.m., Emily finally removed her gloves and washed her hands for the last time that day. The water ran warm over tired skin. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, no different than the night before. Still quiet, still standing. Captain Walker waited near the exit. They offered me an escort, he said. I declined. Emily nodded. You always do. He paused. You could have let me speak for you. Emily met his eyes. You did. When it mattered, he smiled just slightly. I'm proud of you. Emily accepted the words without deflection. Thank you. As she stepped outside, the evening air felt cooler, calmer. The hospital behind her hummed with ordinary life again. The crisis had passed, but its lesson hadn't, because somewhere between humiliation and command, between silence and authority, a line had been drawn, and once drawn, it could never be unseen. By the second evening, Riverside Memorial had settled into a rhythm that felt almost fragile in its normalcy. The ER buzzed with familiar sounds, rolling carts murmured updates, the soft chime of monitors, yet beneath it ran a current of awareness that hadn't been there before. People listened more closely. They looked twice. They paused. Emily Carter returned for the next shift without ceremony. No escort, no acknowledgement beyond a few nods and quiet greetings. She preferred it that way. Normal work had a gravity of its own, and she welcomed it. Linda Morales met her at the nurse's station, clipboard tucked under her arm. Trauma triage lead is official, she said, matter of fact. Temporary. Review in 30 days. Emily skimmed the board. Coverage full, Linda replied. And she hesitated. I reassigned staffing so you're not alone during peak. Emily glanced at her. Thank you. Linda nodded, once relieved. There were still things she didn't know how to say. She was learning when silence was the better choice. In ICU, the first patient the man pulled from the roadside opened his eyes to daylight for the first time since admission. His breathing was steady now, the lines of pain softened. When Emily entered to check his vitals, his gaze tracked her immediately. They're keeping watch, he said quietly, nodding toward the guard by the door. Yes, Emily replied. It won't last forever. He studied her face. You never promised forever. No, she said. I promised care. He smiled faintly. You delivered. Down the hall, doctor. Brooks briefed a group of residents. His tone had changed. He asked questions instead of issuing commands. When a resident suggested a plan, Brooks paused, weighed it, and nodded. Explain your reasoning, he said. Emily overheard and kept walking. At 10:14 p.m., the second patient spiked briefly. Nothing dangerous, but enough to demand attention. Emily coordinated the response with quiet efficiency, catching a medication interaction before it reached the IV. The room relaxed. Trust settled further into place. Later, as she charted, a security officer approached. Nurse Carter, yes. Captain Walker asked me to pass along a message. He handed her a folded note and left without waiting. Emily opened it. They closed the loop. No names in the press. Patients transferred under proper authority. You did good work. She folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. No response needed. Near midnight, a woman arrived in triage with a deep laceration to her forearm. Kitchen accident, she insisted, eyes darting. Emily noticed the tremor in her hands, the way she flinched when voices rose behind her. Let's get you stitched up, Emily said gently. You're safe here. The woman's shoulders loosened. She nodded. While suturing, the woman whispered, You don't talk much. Emily smiled softly. I listen. That helps, the woman said. When the sutures were done and the woman discharged, Emily stood for a moment at the sink, letting the water run. She thought of the ways safety could be built, not with noise or spectacle, but with presence. At 1:36 a.m., hospital administration circulated a brief memo commendations for staff professionalism during a security incident. Reinforcement of verification protocols. Zero mention of names. Emily read it once and moved on. Linda found her later, leaning against the counter with tired eyes. "They wanted a photo," Linda said quietly. I said no. Emily met her gaze. "You did the right thing." Linda laughed softly, a sound of release. "I'm learning." Emily nodded. "So am I." As dawn approached, the ER breathed easier. The ICU patients stabilized further. Guards rotated out. The glass walls reflected pale light instead of tension. Dr. Brooks approached Emily near the end of shift. "I've been asked to mentor the new residents," he said, "on triage judgment." Emily considered. "You'll do well." He hesitated. "Would you?" "Sit in," Emily finished. "Yes." She nodded. "If schedules allow." His shoulders relaxed. "Thank you." At shift change, Emily handed off triage with concise notes, then paused at the threshold of the ER. She looked back once, not to claim anything, not to mark territory, but to ensure continuity. Everything was in place. Outside, the early morning air was cool and clean. The city was waking up, unaware of how close the night had come to breaking something fragile, and how quietly it had been held together instead. Emily walked to her car and sat for a moment, hands resting on the wheel. She didn't replay the humiliation. She didn't savor the command. She thought instead of the steady pulse returning to normal, of a breath evening out of a room, learning to listen. Justice, she knew, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived as a correction, sometimes as a pause, sometimes as the humility to say, "I was wrong," and mean it. She started the engine. The hospital receded behind her, not as a battlefield, but as a place of work. A place worth protecting. The night Emily Carter returned for her final shift of the week, the ER felt different in a way that was hard to name. Not quieter, not slower, more aware. It was the kind of awareness that settled after a near miss, after everyone realized how close things had come to unraveling. Voices carried less edge. Orders were given with explanation instead of assumption. Even the fluorescent lights seemed less harsh, as if the space itself had learned restraint. Emily took her place at triage without announcement. She reviewed the board-checked, staffing-adjusted flow for an incoming ambulance from 5 miles out. Everything was routine, and yet people noticed. A young nurse paused before speaking. "Emily, we've got a possible stroke coming in. ETA 3 minutes. Emily nodded. "Prep Bay 2. Notify imaging. I'll take lead." No one questioned it. Linda Morales watched from the nurse's station, arms folded loosely, not defensively this time. She had spent years believing leadership meant being heard above everyone else. Now she understood something else entirely. Leadership meant knowing when to step back. The ambulance arrived on time. The patient was assessed, moved, treated. No drama, no raised voices, just competence flowing from one set of hands to another. As the hours passed, Emily noticed small changes everywhere. Dr. Brooks asked a resident what they thought before offering his own opinion. A senior nurse corrected a mistake quietly, without spectacle. Security checked credentials without embarrassment or aggression, just procedure clean and respectful. None of it felt forced. It felt earned. Near midnight, Emily received a message through the internal system ICU requesting consult trauma, 1 patient asking for you. She walked upstairs, her steps unhurried. The man lay propped slightly upright now, color good, eyes clear. When he saw her, his expression softened with relief. "They told me I'm being transferred tomorrow," he said. "Yes," Emily replied. "Long-term care. You'll recover." He nodded, then studied her. "You never said goodbye." Emily tilted her head. "You're still here." He smiled faintly. "You know what I mean." She considered that, then spoke honestly. "I don't like endings. I prefer continuity." He exhaled, understanding. "You were the best constant I've had in a long time." Emily met his gaze. "Take care of yourself." "I will," he said. "Because someone did." As she turned to leave, he added, "They asked me about you." Emily paused. "And I told them the truth," he said. "That you saved my life without asking who I was." Emily nodded once. "That's enough." Back in the ER, Captain Walker stood near the exit jacket on, ready to leave. He looked older in civilian light, the lines around his eyes deeper, but also lighter, as if something heavy had finally been set down. "This is it," he said as Emily approached. She nodded. "It usually is." They closed the investigation. Walker continued. Contractors disbanded. Oversight triggered higher up. You won't hear about it again. Emily met his eyes. Good. They offered you options, he added carefully. Positions. Advisory roles. I know, Emily said. And I declined. Walker smiled, not surprised. Of course you did. She studied him for a moment. Thank you. For standing up. He shook his head. I stood when you needed space to keep doing your job. That's different. He hesitated, then added, You don't owe silence to anyone anymore. Emily considered that. Silence was never about hiding. It was about focus. Walker nodded. Then keep it. They exchanged a quiet look, one built on shared history, shared restraint, and then he turned and walked out, disappearing into the night without ceremony. The ER clock ticked past 3:00 a.m. Emily finished her charting, handed off triage, and stepped outside as dawn began to stretch thin light across the horizon. The hospital behind her hummed with ordinary urgency. Lives continuing, crises rising and falling. No helicopters, no commands, no spectacle. And yet something permanent had changed. She sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine, hands resting lightly on the wheel. She thought of the humiliation that had once burned under bright lights, and how quickly it had dissolved when truth entered the room. She thought of how authority had tried to shout and how it had been answered by calm. Strength, she knew, didn't need volume. It needed clarity. As Emily drove away, Riverside Memorial stood quiet behind her, not as a place of conflict, but as a place that had learned something essential. That respect isn't granted by rank. That justice doesn't always arrive with force. And that sometimes the most powerful moment in a room comes from someone who speaks only when it matters. In life, the loudest voice in the room is not always the strongest one. We're taught sometimes subtly, sometimes harshly, that confidence must be visible, that authority must be announced, that worth must be proven again and again in front of others. But real strength often lives in silence. It shows up in preparation, in restraint, in choosing what matters over what feels good in the moment. Emily's story reminds us that being underestimated is not a curse, it's a test. A test of whether you'll let other people's assumptions define you, or whether you'll stay grounded in who you are and what you know. She didn't fight back with anger. She didn't demand recognition. She simply did the right thing over and over until the truth could no longer be ignored. There will be moments in your life when you are judged unfairly. When people mistake your calm for weakness, your humility for lack of ability, your silence for fear. In those moments you have a choice. You can become louder to prove yourself, or you can become better and let your actions speak when it truly counts. Justice doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly in a single sentence in a room that finally learns to listen. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated or judged unfairly? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments, someone else might need it today. And if you believe in stories about quiet strength, hidden courage, and justice done right, make sure to subscribe. More powerful stories are coming, and you won't want to miss the next one.